Hello and welcome. I am Thomas Porteous and you're watching the World Report on NewsX World. Let's take a look at some of the top stories of the hour. Taiwan's media reports that 9 people were injured and among them 4 are critically after a suspect released smoke bombs at a Taipei subway station and then attacked bystanders. Taiwan Premier Cho Jung-tae has confirmed the attack in Taipei as motives of the attacker remain unclear. Lebanese and Israeli representatives at the 15th meeting of a US-backed committee focusing on strengthening the Lebanese army as a key guarantor of security. Lebanese President Joseph Aoun said border villages returns are a priority as Israel and US presses Lebanon to disarm Hezbollah by the year end. French President Emmanuel Macron has said that Europe may need to re-engage in direct talks with Russian President Vladimir Putin if US-led efforts to broker a Ukraine peace deal fail, while report warning that Europe is being sidelined. Greece's Coast Guard has rescued about 545 migrants from a fishing boat off the island off Gavdos, one of the largest migrant arrivals in recent months. The Greek Coast Guard said that they were found during a search operation with some 16 nautical miles south of Gavdos. According to an official from Ukraine's SBU, Ukrainian aerial drones struck a Russian Shadow Fleet tanker in the Mediterranean Sea for the first time, hitting the vessel Quendil more than 2,000 kilometers from Ukraine and causing critical damage, marking a significant escalation once again. Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese said the country will launch a national gun buyback scheme after the mass shooting in Bondi Beach that killed 15 people as hundreds gathered for a vigil and paddle out at the site. While police detained 7 men in a separate incident as government pursues reform. French lawmakers have failed to agree on a 2026 budget compromise, raising the risk of emergency legislation to roll over spending and avoid a shutdown after a joint committee collapsed talks, while central bank governor Francois Villeroy de Gallau has warned that such a stopgap would widen the deficit. EU leaders agreed at a Brussels summit to provide European Union support worth 90 billion euros to Ukraine over the next 2 years, but failed to reach a deal on using frozen Russian assets, while Ukraine warns that it could run out of money by the second quarter of 2026 without EU backing. We start this hour in Europe, and Russian President Vladimir Putin says he does not take responsibility for the loss of life in the war in Ukraine, a conflict that has killed tens of thousands of people on both sides. Speaking during his annual press conference in Moscow, Putin said that Russia does not consider itself responsible because, in his words, it did not start the war. He repeated his long-standing claim that Ukraine and Western countries are to blame for the fighting. Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022, triggering Europe's largest conflict since the Second World War. Putin's comments come as the war continues with no clear end in sight and as international pressure on Moscow remains high over civilian casualties and widespread destruction. Joining us now is Alison Mutler. She is the former Associated Press Bureau Chief of Romania, and she joins us live from Bucharest. Thank you very much, Alison, for joining us here on NewsX World. It's a pleasure to talk to you as always. Of course, it's a huge event actually today. Vladimir Putin's year-end press conference. The Russian president sits behind a podium for hours answering questions from various both Russian and international journalists. These were some comments that came out today from him saying that, and reiterating a Russian talking point, that Russia is not responsible for this war. Ukraine and NATO are. Your thoughts on Vladimir Putin reaffirming this nearly 3 years into fighting, where we don't have a firm number on how many troops have died, but it's rumored to be around 1 million people between both of the countries. Once again, Vladimir Putin ushering in his talking points there. Did you watch the press conference today, Alison? What were your thoughts on his statements, if so?
I've seen reports of the press conference. I didn't watch it myself, but his comments are what are to be expected of Vladimir Putin. To be honest, any dictator, he is an authoritarian dictator. The suppression of dissidents and anybody who doesn't toe the Kremlin line in Russia is as bad as it was under the Soviet Union. So, in fact, anyone who who criticizes Russia's operation in Ukraine, its invasion, it's not called an invasion, it's called a special military operation, can be fined or even put into prison. So we start with somebody who is an absolute dictator and does not accept any criticism or dissent. Any Russian media that reports critically on Russia, they have their newsrooms outside Russia. I mean, there are a few publications that do publish semi-independently, but they're generally about economic facts. But anybody who politically criticizes Vladimir Putin can expect to be put in prison. So somebody who is a dictator like Vladimir Putin will never, ever admit to any responsibility or fault. I mean, in my career, I've interviewed people who've been accused of genocide, and they never, ever admit any responsibility or acknowledge absolutely anything. It's part of their mindset. Perhaps that's why they can go ahead and allow, as you said, up to 1 million people, to die or to be killed on both sides, of course. And it's not just Russians, it's Ukrainians, it's Russians, it's civilian, it's troops. So he doesn't accept. He said he was forced to do this war. He was forced to invade because of the Western NATO. And in the Western NATO, that is laughable. But in Russia, that is the official line. And that's what he wants his people to believe. And many of them actually do it. So he will never take any responsibility for absolutely anything. And today, it's a chance. This is not a press conference in the sense of how we would understand a press conference, when an official gets out there and is asked questions. Some of them might make him or her feel uncomfortable. These are curated questions. They are questions that are what we call little tennis balls that are thrown to them that he can just answer in a way that suits him. So even though he claims to have had they claim to have been 3 million questions put to him, the questions he will have been asked will be ones in which he can present himself in the best possible light. This is a dictatorship. There is no free press. Journalists, his enemies, his rivals, they are killed, or at best they're put in prison. So we cannot expect anything like we would consider the truth to come out of his mouth. So I'm not surprised. This is a very important moment for him. He's pushing forward his talking points, and particularly he thinks America is on his side. He's trying to bully Europe into getting into line, and he wants them sidelined from the talks. So this is him presenting himself, as you like, as the emperor.
Yes, and Alison, while Vladimir Putin was holding this press conference in Moscow, Zelensky was in Warsaw, where he warned of potential future Russian aggression, this time towards Poland, where he said that Russia will inevitably come for Poland if it defeats Ukraine straight after. Putin then said that Russia won't attack anyone if treated, as he calls, with respect. Now, of course, the Kremlin have once again and again said that they have no ambition to attack NATO. However, drone incursions and other aggressive tactics, some would say that can be seen as otherwise. Your thoughts on this other Russian talking point here, that Moscow has no ambition to attack NATO or, of course, the European continent either?
Well, one thing is what he says, and another is what he does. I mean, nobody thought that Russia would invade Ukraine, did they? Almost 4 years ago. And as you say, there have been drone incursions, particularly in Poland, but also in Romania and Denmark, and I think Belgium as well. And I think just a couple of weeks ago, Vladimir Putin said that Russia was ready for war. And he called the European leaders little piglets or pigs or something recently, a couple of days ago. So he's very hostile towards Europe's. And let us not forget the hybrid war, which hasn't been mentioned in this peace treaty or this peace deal. Russia has been waging a hybrid war against European societies, democratic societies, at least for the last 10 years. And I can't see he's going to give up that. He considers the West, liberal democracies, an existential threat. And if he feels under threat, he will attack. He's shown that time and time again. So maybe he won't get, I mean, he's been threatening his nuclear weapons and thank heavens he hasn't used them, but he will always be on the offensive to Europe. He is hostile to Europe. He is hostile to democracy. He is hostile to a place where people have freedom. He is hostile to a place where the courts and the press aren't controlled. He considers Europe an existential threat. So what he says, we won't attack you, that may be what he says, but I wouldn't trust him.
Alison Mutler, thank you as always for joining us. It's always a pleasure to talk to you on these issues. We now move on to South Asia for our next story, and thousands of protesters have marched through Bangladesh's capital of Dhaka after Friday prayers demanding justice for a prominent student leader who was shot dead earlier this month. Demonstrators called for the arrest and punishment of those responsible for killing Sharif Osman Hadi, a key figure in last year's student uprising. The 32-year-old was shot by masked gunmen on December the 12th while leaving a mosque in the Bangladeshi capital and later died from his injuries. Protesters carried banners and chanted slogans accusing authorities of failing to protect activists and to hold perpetrators accountable. The killing has sparked widespread anger across the country, with student groups warning protests will continue until those behind the attack are brought to justice. We're now joined by Major General Dr. Rajan Kochhar. He's an international relations and defence expert. He joins us live from New Delhi. Of course, Dr. Kochhar, the situation in Dhaka and in Bangladesh as a whole remains rather volatile, of course, after the killing of this individual that was a key figure in those protests, those violent protests of last year. As election day, of course, in Bangladesh draws nearer and nearer, what does it say when incidents like these happen for the political stability of the country long term?
Thank you, Thomas. You've a very important discussion, because Bangladesh is a neighbor of India. 5 Indian states have borders with Bangladesh today, and it's a 4,096 square kilometers of boundary. So whatever happens in Bangladesh, if there is an instability there, it is going to affect the Indian subcontinent, or India in actually particular. And Hadi, this gentleman who has been killed, he was a senior leader of the protest group called, a student protest group called Inqilab Manch, Inqilab Mancha as you call it. And he was prominent in this uprising in Bangladesh, which we saw after Sheikh Hasina was ousted. And he has been a strong exponent, a proponent of an anti-Awami League movement in Bangladesh. He was instrumental in organizing large-scale protests in Bangladesh, and therefore his killing has sparked a massive unrest among his followers, who are mostly the youth of a particular strata of the society of Bangladesh, prominently being the Muslims. And they are trying to vent their anger on the anti-India rhetoric, because that is what has been the narrative in Bangladesh. in the last 18 months, I've been following Bangladesh. So there has been an anti-India rhetoric, a narrative has been building up in Bangladesh, and therefore these large-scale protests are directed at against the Indian embassy in Bangladesh, and unfortunately, I would like to say here, the Bangladesh state has not been able to contain these people, and therefore they have targeted some media houses also in Bangladesh. So, in my overall analysis, I would just like to say one thing, that the situation is volatile. The situation is not good for Bangladesh and India relations. The border management mechanism is going to come under strain. Already, there have been some incidents
Yes.
in the Bay of Bengal, where these fishermen have transgressed into the Indian territory. So I actually visualize that it's a very difficult situation. It will have to be tackled diplomatically by the Indian establishment, because
Yes.
Mohammed Yunus is not too fond of India, and the kind of statements which are coming from Bangladesh do not augur well for the future Indo-Bangladesh relationships. So India is waiting for the outcome of the elections, which I feel, my analysis actually goes that maybe these elections will not take place, because Mohammed Yunus would like to stay in power for a longer time, and maybe I don't have a concrete
Yes.
evidence to give you right now, but maybe these incidents have the blessings of Mohammed Yunus in order to
Okay.
create a unstable situation in Bangladesh, so that they don't go ahead with the elections.
Dr. Kachar, thank you very much for joining us here on NewsX World. It's always a pleasure to have you on the programme. We now move on over to West Asia for our next story, and Israeli forces have carried out airstrikes and artillery fire across northern and southern Gaza, according to witnesses. In southern Gaza, warplanes hit multiple sites in eastern Khan Yunis, while artillery and ground fire were reported nearby. Israeli gunboats also opened fire off the coast, targeting fishing boats at sea, according to reports. And in northern Gaza, an airstrike hit the Surjaya neighborhood of Old Gaza City, sending plumes of smoke into the sky. There is no immediate word on casualties, however. Gaza's health ministry says hundreds of Palestinians have been killed and wounded in what it calls ceasefire violations. The ministry adds that overall casualties since October 2023 continue to rise despite the truce. Joining us now is Peter Baum, the editor of the Weekly Blitz. He joins us live from London. Peter, thank you very much for joining us. Of course, there is further strikes in Gaza about something that Hamas and people on the ground are calling ceasefire violations. Once again, how is Israel justifying these airstrikes, artillery fire, even naval attacks across southern and northern Gaza in the past 24 hours? Of course, this comes as Steve Witkoff, Qatari, Turkey and Egyptian officials are in Miami, moving on to on talks about moving on to the second phase of the ceasefire deal. Your thoughts on this renewed violence with that diplomatic backdrop? Peter, I believe you're muted.
Can you hear me, Thomas?
Yes, I can hear you, Peter.
Oh, fine. Apologies about that. I'm not, to answer your question, Thomas, I'm not sure that Israel feels the need to justify these ceasefire violations, because there's a picture here, a much bigger picture, which the interested players are wishing to achieve. They all want to implement phase 2 of the Trump plan, which in their minds will go ahead in the early part of next year. Let's be realistic, February or March of next year. And until that plan can come to fruition, several things have got to happen. The most important is that Hamas has to be more weakened than it is already weakened. And that is the political justification
Peter,
for Israel.
Isn't that just a continuation of war? Isn't that simply the talking point that the Israelis were using in the full fledge of the conflict? The focus is on right now is Hamas being disarmed, right?
Absolutely right. Now, Thomas, I'm not disagreeing with you. Call it what you like. The ceasefire, as it stands, is still going to be called a ceasefire, even though the Israelis and to a certain extent Hamas have broken the ceasefire as it was numerous times. So let's be realistic. The powers that be will continue to determine through the world's media, through news stations and through their governments that the ceasefire is still a ceasefire, although it's been broken on numerous occasions. It's rather like, I can't give a corollary at the moment, but the United Nations and those countries that want to implement phase 2 will continue to justify Israel's actions because their main objective has, which they want to be achieved, is the implementation of phase 2, and unless some enormous red lines are crossed, these ceasefire violations that happened last week, 3 weeks ago, a month ago, 2 months ago, are going to be lost in various stories. They're not going to be remembered for what they are. Only the political activists will start pointing fingers, the social media influencers, etc. But the powers that be are willing to allow Israel to continue to weaken Hamas with the expectation and objective that come early next year, phase 2 will be implemented, which would be far more difficult with a Hamas as emboldened and as strong as it once was.
Okay, Peter, do stay with us as we have further updates coming out of the enclave. And a global hunger monitor says that there is no longer famine in Gaza after access for humanitarian aid and commercial food deliveries improved following a fragile October the 10th ceasefire in the war between Israel and Hamas. The latest assessment by the Integrated Food Security Phase classification comes 4 months after it said 514,000 people, nearly a quarter of Palestinians in Gaza, were experiencing famine. For a region to be classified as in famine, at least 20% of the people must be suffering extreme food shortages, with 1 in 3 children acutely malnourished and 2 people out of every 10,000 dying from starvation or malnutrition and disease. Peter, Israeli officials are now pointing to this report that conditions have improved in the enclave. However, what are your thoughts on that reaction now and using the IMF now as evidence that conditions have improved when they straight up denied the report prior to that?
It's interesting, Thomas, but paradoxically, it almost reverts back to the previous story, and let me explain why. We know that there's a ceasefire, but it's not really a ceasefire. We know that there's a famine, but was there really a famine? I've been following this situation, this conflict, daily since October the 7th and before that. I saw no famine when Al Jazeera reporters and their camera crew were reporting on the situation and interviewing doctors. They weren't affected by the famine. I saw no famine when, for example, the hostages were released at various stages during this conflict, and thousands of Palestinians came out. If you remember seeing the scenes mobbing the Red Cross, those Palestinians weren't affected by famine. We saw just weeks ago mass weddings beautifully carried out in Gaza with thousands of people attending. They
Peter,
weren't affected by famine. So who are these people that are affected by famine?
Peter,
I've actually looked
apologies
for
for
names,
interrupting.
Thomas. I could only find 2 names of 2 children that supposedly have died from famine, and both of those poor children were suffering from underlying chronic diseases, which they had only weeks to live anyway. So was there really a famine? Is there a famine? Is the famine over? I think we have to take what some of these United Nations NGOs state as lacking credibility. So if indeed the situation has improved, but there is still need for more incoming aid and food, so be it. But the famine in Gaza was not the famine that we are used to, not like Sudan or the
Okay.
Congo or Darfur. So if the situation is improving, all well and good, but I don't think there was a true famine in the first place.
Peter, of course, we clarified previously that 20% of people in the population must be suffering extreme food shortages, and of course that means that not everyone is affected in exactly the same way. Statistics-wise, of course, the World Health Organization and the Gaza Ministry of Health reported that 361 people had died due to malnutrition since the conflict began in 2023. Some media reporting higher than that. Of course, that is the statistics coming out of the World Health Organization. Peter, apologies, we have run out of time. Thank you very much for joining us. It's always a pleasure to talk to you on these matters. We now move on over to the Indo-Pacific for our next story. And at least 9 people have been injured after an attack at a Taipei subway station. Taiwan's Premier Cho Chung-tae said a suspect released smoke bombs inside the station and then attacked bystanders. Details on the victims were not immediately released. Taiwan's local reports suggest that the attacker is suspected to have killed himself after the incident. Police cordoned off a shopping mall where the suspect reportedly ran off. Authorities say the motive behind the attack remains unclear as investigations continue. Well, that's all that we have time for. Keep watching NewsX World for more international updates.